Patient rushed to the ER, overdosed on heroin. There's just one problem. The patient is only 4 years old. Cops say his own father, angry over a divorce, injects the little boy in the neck with a deadly heroin cocktail. That father now facing attempted first-degree murder charges. Let me go to Jill Ryan, news anchor for News Talk 92.3 KTAR. Jill, give us more of the backstory here, because when I hear about a divorce, and I know that in a courthouse, the most dangerous courtrooms are the ones where people are going through family issues as opposed to the criminal courts. And is this a case that this was a bitter divorce and mom was going to move away with this child?
Well, it's a situation where we know that the father, 37-year-old Eric Lennon, had a history of drug addiction. He was described in court documents as being a drug dealer in addition to being an addict. So there was obviously some trouble there. We also know there was trouble on the home front, and that the wife, Saradia, had actually written in the custody agreement that any visitation with the father, Eric, would include drug testing so that she knew her little boy was going to be safe.
So mom knew that dad had a history here. Now, why did mom leave the child with dad, knowing this history?
Well, I think she was trying to protect. Everything that we've seen so far indicates she was trying to protect her son. She was actually living in San Francisco and was planning on relocating, and in fact had a job interview in Seattle. So she left the little boy with his father overnight so that she could actually go to the job interview, and she had tried to reach them and wasn't able to, and that's when she actually went over to the house.
Joe Schrank, interventionist, founder of Rebound Brooklyn. Joe, let me ask you, if someone is a drug addict and they have issues, and perhaps they're using and they're taking care of their child, could they be under the influence of these drugs to such an extent that they don't know what they're doing in bringing harm to their own child? Or is that impossible in this situation and he knew what he was doing?
It's unlikely that he didn't know exactly what he was doing. I mean, heroin addiction is a very serious addiction, and it's something that, but people are, more than likely, people who are under the influence of heroin are nodding out, and so it seems like a fairly calculated act. I would question the judgment of the mother. I mean, the idea of leaving your child, a 4-year-old child, with somebody with any kind of history of heroin addiction where she doesn't know his current state is irresponsible, and she's complicit in this. Mike Gottlieb, I just want to go to you, and Mark, Lonnie, and I are all going to listen very closely to what you have to say here. I mean, do you see any defense for this man?
Yeah, absolutely. We see cases like this all the time where individuals have, he's probably got a bipolar disorder or a chronic depressive disorder, anxiety over perhaps losing his child. He's clearly self-medicating with a cocktail of different drugs. I heard ketamine, cocaine, heroin. I don't know how anybody could say that this is a person who's in their right state of mind. First of all, if he's diagnosed with a major mental health disorder and he's self-medicating, I'm suspect that he could, there's no way that he knows the difference between right and wrong, the nature and the consequences of actions. I do understand that it's somewhat goal-directed and that argues against insanity, but there's just no way, given the nature of the family law case, as you were saying, the high emotions, the depression, the long-standing drug history, I don't think he was in his right frame of mind. Absolutely not.
All right, Mark, I'll let you start off. I don't know how someone doesn't know they're injecting their own child in the neck with heroin.
Right.
Well, Vinny, of course he knew what he was doing. This was a classic revenge. She was leaving him. The divorce was going to be finalized. He was taking his vengeance out on her. He was using the child as a weapon against the woman who had scorned him and was leaving him. It's as simple as that. He knew what he was doing.
Joe Schrank, is there a way to speak to an addict after the fact about an incident like this, to understand what they knew and what was going on at that moment? Is there a way that you can tell or ascertain whether an addict has a recollection? And
well, look, addicts are notorious for not taking responsibility for anything. I mean, his story is going to be he was out of his mind, he was high on heroin, he didn't know, so on and so forth. That will be, look, any of us who work with addicts, most people in America know somebody with some kind of addictive impairment. They understand, anything that starts with, which is one of the things I read in the paper, is that the mother knew that he had a history of addiction, but he told her that he was not using. I mean, really, a heroin addict told you he wasn't using, and you just went ahead and thought that was okay to let your kid go into that house? So he's going to deny it. There's no question about it. He'll play the "I was out of my mind" card. There really isn't any sort of way if there are no eyewitnesses. But the truth is, like, that is a calculated thing. It isn't, he slipped on the needle. The guy cooked the heroin, he put it in the syringe, and he injected somebody with it. And so there is an element of choice here, sure, and there is an element of responsibility. Also, this also sounds like more than addiction. It sounds like some kind of psychosis. Heroin addicts they don't want to share their heroin with anybody, their 4-year-old or anybody else. So if this was a purely addictive act and he was just out of his mind, this seems much more calculating to me than that. So I wouldn't buy anything that he says.
Lonnie Combs, how difficult is this going to be? Because you've got a criminal defendant who himself was under the influence, was overdosed on these drugs.
Right, but he made that choice. He was under the influence because he decided to take those drugs. I would love to take this case as the prosecutor. Look, as it was pointed out, he's an addict. They're very manipulative and expert liars. So anything that he says about this, you cannot trust. This was not just a happenstance. It was on the day that the divorce was final, that he had tried to stop. So there's a reason and a motive for it happening on this date. And not only was he just shooting up anybody, it was his child, and a 4-year-old child. Anyone who has a 4-year-old or experience with a 4-year-old knows they're not going to just sit there and get stuck with a needle. This child was probably screaming, crying. He had to forcefully not only shoot him in the neck, but also in the buttocks several times before they both passed out, essentially. So there's clear intent behind it. It's not just oh, you know what, I'm just going to shoot up whoever's around me. And there's a reason for it to happen on the day it happened. So I think a jury's not going to have a problem with seeing that this is a very intentional act by this person, whether he happened to be high or not.
Lonnie, I agree. I think timing is everything in this case. And you talk about the divorce being finalized. That's the day he chooses to do what he does. Tells me a lot about what happened here. When we come back, more on the father accused of injecting his 4-year-old son in the neck with heroin.
Looking for great American values? We've got them now during the Lazy Boy Furniture Gallery's Red, White, and Blue sale. Don't miss this Columbus Day event. Now.
Welcome back. Cops say a father angry over his divorce wants to get back at his estranged wife, so he injects their 4-year-old son in the neck with heroin. It's a miracle. The 4-year-old survives, but dad is now facing attempted first-degree murder. Jill Ryan is with us, news anchor from KTAR 92.3. Jill, how about the scene? Because the mother discovered her child and her estranged husband OD'd. What was the scene that she described seeing when she went to go find her child?
So Saradia she was actually trying to reach her ex, Eric, on the phone, and when he didn't answer the phone, she actually drove over there to get her son, and she walked into their bedroom when they didn't answer the door, and she found the two sleeping. They had the blankets pulled up to their neck, and so she thought they were napping until she tried to wake the little boy up. He wasn't responding, and so she pulled the blanket down just a little bit, and she saw a syringe sticking out of his neck. It had a dark, tarry substance in it, so she called 911.
Bethany Marshall, we've been talking about it here tonight. Our guess is Dad is going to say he doesn't remember anything. He was so out of it, he didn't know what he did. In questioning someone like this, in a session where you're trying to figure out their mental state at the time, is there a way to figure out if this guy is lying, if he does really remember what he did?
I think in this case, I would probably just assume that everything he says is a lie And what I would assume is that he was contemplating murder-suicide for quite some time. What we know in catathymic homicide is that it sort of becomes like a compulsion where the person's wish to murder another person waxes and wanes at an unconscious level a long period of time, and all of a sudden the intent spills over into a true act. The symbolic significance of the day is what I would focus on. I mean, the fact is, the day that his wife finalized the divorce, which is an abandonment of him in his own mind, that would be a rejection and an abandonment, he strikes out and attempts to destroy probably the most precious thing in her life, and that is her little boy. It's as if he's saying, you're going to take my life away from me, I'm going to take your little boy away from you. And I can't imagine the malice involved in injecting this little boy in the neck and in the buttocks several times, looking at the suffering, and then experiencing the nodding out together. It's so similar to the psychology of murder-suicide. With murder-suicide, usually you have a personality disordered male, usually depressed, and a non-personality disordered female who is separating and individuating from the male, and that process of the woman becoming more autonomous precipitates homicidal rage. Only in this case, the homicidal intent got acted out towards the little boy instead of acted out towards the wife. Although as I was listening to the panel, it did occur to me that he may have had a homicidal intent towards her too. It'd be interesting to see if they uncovered a plot to kill her, or if he had made some attempt in the past via domestic violence, but if she was simply too strong for him, so he chose to pick on and victimize a little boy instead.
Jill, was there any history that we know about? Violence towards
there was
estranged wife?
A long history, actually, going back to about the start of 2005. Back then, Eric was actually hospitalized for attempted suicide. Cops went to his house and they found him. He had apparently tried to injure himself with some scissors, so they had him hospitalized and committed. He says he was only suicidal, though, because he was coming down from a heroin addiction. And then in 2012, there was a domestic dispute. And also, he had overdosed, and he had been hospitalized and treated for a drug overdose at that time as well. So there was a long history of drug and domestic disputes.
Joe Schrank, what do you think's driving what happened here? Is this a man who's angry about his divorce, wants to get back at his wife, and uses the drugs as the delivery method to act out his plot? Or is it the drugs that is causing him to do what he did?
It sounds like it's some of both. It sounds like he's definitely driven by malice and rage, for sure, at the situation. But if a long history of heroin addiction specifically, that's going to produce a lot of cognitive distortions with people. People don't heal from heroin addiction. It takes a very long time before they're a person who is recognizable and able to keep the social contract. The other thing about heroin addiction is that it's something that people do in a very isolated way. They nod a lot. They're not typically aggressive. I don't know, the idea of heroin addicts fighting is absurd. And so there's something about this that also speaks to his psychiatric condition, which may have been fanned. If the heroin addiction is the fan on the flame of a psychiatric condition, it's very difficult to know until people are in recovery for long periods of time, and then you can sort of see what the other issues may or may not be. So, first and foremost, this is a situation, and again, I go back to the mother. I just think, look, if you have a history of domestic violence, your ex is a drug dealer and a heroin addict, what are you doing sending the kid there for an overnight? It's just irresponsible. And I think that, one of the things is people don't get in the position of this man alone. We're responsible as community members. We're responsible as family members. We're responsible as just everyone in the country. We see these things and we look the other way. And that kind of a dynamic produces these very sad effects. We don't do a very good job treating mental illness in the country. And so these kinds of incidents, they bubble up, and it's very easy to demonize this guy. Well, he's a horrible person and vengeful about his divorce and his heroin addiction, and that may or may not be true, that whatever his motivation is. But to me, I can't get past the idea of sending this kid to go stay with his father. You know, it would be interesting to know what the judge ruled in terms of visitation or custody, because whether she was on a job interview or not, it's just not appropriate to send children into that.
Well, the miracle of this whole story, again, is that 4-year-old boy did, in fact, survive, and our thoughts are with him tonight.